There are some homes that never lack voices, yet they feel completely lifeless. Places where people talk endlessly about honor, power, and being right, but no one ever pauses to ask a simple question. Is what I believe actually true? Today's story does not begin with a miracle. It does not open with war or glory or a triumphant scene. It begins inside a house like that. A house where certainty echoed every day and silence was treated like guilt. This was the house of Abu Lahab, a name tied to influence, lineage, and pride in Mecca. In that place, there was no room for doubt and no space for tenderness. Every sentence carried the same message. We are the ones who stand on the right side. The walls were used to curses. The nights passed with anger that had been cultivated like identity. No one truly listened to anyone else, because everyone was convinced they could not be wrong. And yet inside that suffocating atmosphere, a quiet paradox began to form. Not in screaming, not in arguments, but in the silence of a child who was not asked for her opinion, not given the right to speak, not treated as important. And because of that, no one noticed that something was moving inside her young heart. Truth does not always arrive like a declaration. It does not knock down the door. Sometimes it comes as a feeling you cannot name, a restless discomfort creeping into what everyone else calls obvious. Durrah grew up surrounded by curses aimed at Muhammad. She grew up hearing hatred repeated so often that people forgot why they hated in the first place. But every time his name was spoken with hostility, something opposite rose inside her. Not fear, not hatred, just a vague, unsettling sense that something was deeply wrong. She did not know why. No one explained. No explanation was offered, but she began to notice differences. The difference between faces twisted with rage and faces that stayed calm when speaking about the same man. The difference between words that made a room feel heavier and whispers that somehow softened the heart. When she was still very young, she had seen Muhammad pass through the markets of Mecca without shouting, without revenge, without answering cruelty with cruelty. And that image, even without a name, took root inside her. At night, when the house fell back into its familiar arguments, Durrah would search for rare pockets of quiet. Under the Mecca sky and a cold moon, the voices of adults faded. In those moments, she began to listen, not to other people, but to herself. And the more she listened, the more she realized the house was not loud because it was alive. It was loud because it was afraid of losing power, afraid of being challenged, afraid of a truth that could collapse everything they were clinging to. This story matters not because it involves a famous family, but because it touches a question most people are terrified to face. What happens when truth does not appear where you expect it, but inside the very place you assume is darkest? What if light does not choose the houses people respect, but finds the hearts people overlook? Welcome to Prophetic History Explained, where we do not just repeat history, we peel back its deepest layers to understand why these stories still shake people today. And if you can already feel that this story is not like anything you have heard before, stay with us until the end. Because the ending is not only unsettling, it forces you to look back at yourself. And if you value history told with depth, emotion, and truth that does not flinch, subscribe to Prophetic History Explained to support us. Your support is what keeps the untold stories coming into the light. There are some truths that do not need to be taught in order to be believed. They reveal themselves through a feeling you cannot name, through a small inner tremor that people often mistake for weakness. Durrah did not begin with a debate over right and wrong. She began with a quiet recognition that something was calling her from within. Not the call of logic, but the call of the heart before it learns how to defend itself. She did not go searching for Islam. Islam found her. It did not enter through the front door. It slipped through the cracks of ordinary life. A sentence overheard late at night. a distant sound carried by the wind, the calm gaze of people, the whole city labeled misguided. No one explained the meaning of the words, no one told her she had to believe, but each time those sounds reached her, her heart tightened as if it had known them for a long time, so long that she could no longer remember when she had lost them. And here is something most people miss. Durrah was not persuaded by the message as much as she was shaken by the state of the people carrying it. They were not loud, they were not trying to win. They walked with a strange steadiness, as if they had already accepted the price of what they believed. While the people around her became more anxious the more they spoke, these believers felt stronger the more they held their silence. That contrast did not need an explanation. It spoke for itself. The first night she heard the Quran, Durrah did not understand the words. She did not know which surah it was, and she could not separate one theme from another. But that was not the point. Those words did not go first into the mind. They touched something deeper. They did not ask for permission. They did not argue. They existed like a truth that stands even if no one accepts it. And that is what made her tremble. She began to realize there are truths that do not need protection through noise, because they are firm on their own. The Quran did not excite her, it quieted her, and in that quiet something important happened, and she began to recognize herself, not as someone's daughter, not as a member of a powerful family, just a human being standing alone in front of a simple question. If this is true, what will I do with it? Durrah had no privilege to believe safely. Her faith was not protected by community support or shelter. It lived in total fragility. Every time she listened, every time she whispered the declaration of faith, she knew that if she were discovered, the cost would be severe. That is why her belief was not emotional impulse. It was a conscious decision repeated every day in silence. Some nights when Mecca finally slept, she followed faint sounds to get closer to those who believed. Their gatherings were unlike anything she had known. There was no moral boasting, no feeling of superiority. Lonely people with bowed heads and trembling voices reminding one another that Allah is one. And in that humility, she felt safe for the first time. Not because danger was gone, but because she no longer had to pretend to be someone else. When she repeated the Shahada, there was no grand ceremony, no crowd to confirm it, only a private moment, a heart accepting truth without demanding a reward. That moment did not make her life easier, it made it harder. But it gave her something she had never had before, inner alignment. From that point on, what she believed and what she felt no longer fought each other. The power of this story is here. Faith does not always begin with certainty. Sometimes it begins with the courage to live with truth even when it makes you lonelier. Durrah did not become fearless overnight, but she became honest with herself. And in a world filled with loud voices, that is the bravest step a human being can take. There are moments in history when every blurry path closes. There is no longer space to hide in anonymous silence, no longer room to disappear inside the crowd. Mount Safa was one of those moments. It was not only a place where a call was made, it was the place where every person was forced to decide where they stood in front of truth. When Muhammad stood and spoke, there was no taunting in his voice and no personal attack. Only a simple question, sharp enough to strip away every defense. If he warned of danger coming, would they believe him? And the crowd answered in a way that history could never ignore. They would believe him because they had never known him to lie. In that instant, truth was established not by spectacle but by a lifetime of moral credibility. But the moment truth was acknowledged, pride reacted. Abu Lahab was not forced to speak. He could have turned away, protected his status, kept the safety of silent distance. But he did not. He stepped forward, inserted himself into the crowd, and tore through that moment with his own voice. not because he failed to understand what was being said, but because he could not tolerate anything greater than his honor and authority. What matters here is this: Abu Lahab did not collapse because the Quran named him. The Quran named him because he exposed himself. His insult was not a flash of anger. It was the outcome of years of certainty that he could never be challenged. And that certainty pushed him into the open where excuses could no longer protect him. For Durrah, Mount Safa meant something entirely different. She did not stand in the center to react. She watched from the edge, from the familiar position of someone overlooked. And from that position, she realized something that chilled her. Some people, when faced with truth, do not rethink. They attack, not because they lack information, but because truth threatens the identity they have built their entire life. When the first verses about Abu Lahab were revealed, Durrah was not surprised. She felt a terrifying confirmation. What she had witnessed was not unfair punishment. It was the naming of a reality that had existed all along. Those verses did not create evil. They forced evil to stand uncovered in the light. That is the core value of this moment. The Quran does not force belief, and it gives people a final chance to choose their position. Abu Lahab chose, and once that choice became public, no argument was needed. Truth does not need protection through noise. It only needs to be placed where it belongs. From that day onward, there was no neutral ground. Silence was no longer harmless. Refusing to choose became a choice. Durrah understood this clearly. Her quiet faith, even before she spoke it aloud, had already placed her inside a new world where every action, every avoidance, carried meaning. No one was perfectly safe anymore. That moment also exposed a harsh spiritual law. When truth appears publicly, it tests not only its enemies, but also those closest to it. Blood, family, and status can no longer hide anyone. Each person is separated from the crowd to stand alone before what they just heard. For Abu Lahab, and it was the moment he closed the door on turning back. For Durrah, it was the moment she understood there would be no gentle way back to the old life. And in that contrast, a moral boundary becomes clear. Not everyone near truth is saved, and not everyone born in darkness is abandoned. So Mount Safa is not just a historical location, it is a symbol of the moment truth forces people to reveal themselves. Not through violence and not through coercion, but through their own reaction to something they cannot control. From that moment, every destiny began moving in the direction each heart chose. There is a boundary that once a person crosses it, every excuse becomes worthless. That boundary is not built by society, and it is not decided by human emotion. It exists quietly but absolutely. Utaybah ibn Abu Lahab crossed that boundary not by accident, but through a deliberate choice. He knew what he was doing. He knew who he was facing. He understood the meaning of what he was about to commit. And that is why this story is not a random tragedy. It is a moral verdict a person signs against himself. Utaybah ibn Abu Lahab was not ignorant. He was raised inside power, trained to believe that bloodline and status could shield him from consequences. After verses exposing his father were revealed, instead of pausing to reflect, he chose confrontation, not with reasoning but with insult. Not by refuting the message, but by targeting what was most sacred within it. When he publicly mocked and abused what he knew was holy, it stopped being disagreement. It became a declaration of defiance against moral order itself. Muhammad did not respond with the posture of personal rage. There was no shouted scolding and no immediate revenge. Only a quiet moment when eyes gathered, and then a supplication was spoken. Short, clear, not fueled by hatred and not explained. Because when justice is handed over to Allah, it does not need human emotion to decorate it. It only needs to be placed where it belongs. What unsettled people was not the dua itself, but what those who heard it understood. Abu Lahab turned pale. He knew there are prayers that do not vanish into empty air. Some words, when spoken by a man protected by truth, follow their target until the target is found. From that moment, fear entered not as a vague feeling, but as cold awareness that human power had reached its final limit. After that, Utaybah ibn Abu Lahab's journey was no longer a normal trip. Every step carried anxiety, every night stop was surrounded by layers of defense. People formed circles, piled luggage, built temporary barriers, hoping that crowds and objects could block what had been set in motion. But in that desperate effort, a reality became obvious. You can build fences to keep animals out, but you cannot build fences to escape the moral consequences of your own choices. That night did not begin with chaos. No screaming, no warning. Everything moved under a heavy silence, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. When the lion appeared, it did not charge blindly. It moved slowly, passing through defenses with no confusion. It did not mistake. It did not wander. It was not distracted by the crowd. Each step looked like deliberate elimination, by bypassing everyone unrelated until it stopped at the exact person the supplication had named. What happened next was not an explosion of violence. It was the completion of a process. Nothing was random. Nothing was sloppy. Everything humans believed would protect them collapsed without drama. And when it ended, what remained was not just terror, but emptiness. The kind of emptiness that forces a question people avoid. What truly holds ultimate power in this world? And this story is not told to feed blind fear. It stands as warning. Not every insult is answered this way, but every deliberate insult leaves a mark inside the moral order of the universe. Allah's justice is not rushed, but it does not lose its target. It does not need spectacle to prove strength. When the conditions are complete, it is carried out with absolute precision. And the deepest meaning is not in the lion, it is in the cold lesson behind it. Knowledge cannot become a shield for arrogance. When someone knows exactly what they are insulting and still proceeds, that knowledge becomes evidence against them. And once the final boundary is crossed, there is no room left for negotiation. Only truth remains standing there, silent, undeniable. There is a truth many people only learn after they finally step out of the place that once held them hostage. Freedom does not mean instant acceptance. When Durrah left Mecca and arrived in Medina, she did not carry the glow of a victor. She carried a heart exhausted from hiding, a faith strong enough not to turn back, but not yet hardened enough to avoid pain when people looked at her with suspicion. Medina was a city of light, but light also exposes what people try to conceal, including an origin you never chose. In her early days there, Durrah realized the shadow of the past does not vanish simply because you have escaped it. Some people did not see her first as a believer. They saw her as the daughter of Abu Lahab. They did not ask what she had chosen, what she had left behind, what she had risked. They saw only the name the Quran had condemned, and they let that name erase the human being standing in front of them. The judgment was not loud, but it was sharp. It did not require cruel words, only a long enough stare to remind her she still did not fully belong. And that is where the central question returns. Can a person escape the honor or the sins of their family? And if they can, who has the authority to confirm it? Durrah did not argue. She did not perform a speech to defend herself. She also did not go back. Instead, she brought the pain to Muhammad not to seek private comfort, but because she understood this was larger than her. It was a question of justice and dignity inside a community. Muhammad did not respond by simply soothing emotion. He did not tell her to be patient and silently absorb harm. He stood before the community publicly, firmly, and established a principle no one could pretend they had not heard. With his words, he cut the invisible chain that tried to imprison people inside bloodline, and he declared that dignity is not inherited, and it is not removed by ancestry. That moment was larger than protecting one person. It set a new moral order where people are measured first by their choices, not by the shadows of their parents. For Durrā, and it was the first time she was seen not as someone's daughter, but as herself. Not because she was perfect, but because she chose truth when nothing guaranteed she would be safe. The story of Abu Lahab's household does not end with a single tragedy. It opens into 3 different roads from the same starting point. One person chose pride and became a permanent warning. One chose deliberate insult and met justice that did not miss. And one chose quiet endurance and loyalty to truth even when it made her lonely. Those endings are not random. They are the natural result of choices repeated long enough to shape destiny. And notice this, Durrā does not leave the story as a symbol of triumph. She is not described as someone who feels no pain. The grief of family, the memory of a brother, the weight of justice all remain. But what changes is her position before Allah. She is no longer defined by where she was born, but by where her heart chose to stand. The deepest value of this ending is responsibility. None of us can inherit salvation through the reputation of our ancestors. And none of us is condemned simply because we were born into a broken house. When every shield falls away, what remains is a simple question. When truth knocks, do we open the door or do we lock it? Durrā lived the rest of her life with a humility that slowly made people forget her origin. Not because the past disappeared, but because her present became too clear to require repetition. Her story became a quiet reminder to the community that Allah does not measure a person by the noise of their family, but by the honesty of their heart when they stand alone. And that is the closing message for all of us. In a world obsessed with labels and rankings and inherited identity, this story returns responsibility to its rightful place. No one can live for you. No one can believe for you. And in the end, no one stands before Allah with you except the heart you have been feeding your entire life. The deepest lesson here is personal responsibility. Faith is not an inheritance to claim, and it is not a label to brag about. It is a living relationship between the human being and truth, and that relationship must be nourished through humility, self-examination, and the courage to choose what is right even when it costs you acceptance. To apply this today, begin with a simple question. In the moments no one can see, how honest are you with what you know is right? Are you silent because you are wise, or because you are afraid? Do you speak for truth or to protect your image? You do not need to answer those questions publicly, but the way you live with them will slowly shape who you become. If this story feels like more than history, if it feels like a mirror, join the Prophetic History Explained community. Here we explore timeless lessons from the lives of the prophets and the moral depth of Islamic history, and we learn how to live with clarity and sincerity in the modern world. And if you value content that is deep, thoughtful, and never built on empty shock, subscribe to Prophetic History Explained to support us. Your support is what keeps these forgotten stories alive and what helps bring more light into a world that desperately needs it.